Good morning. Today is Saturday. It's October the 2nd. The title of today's devotional is Battle, Wounds, and Broken Hearts. Our scripture reading is 2 Samuel chapter 19. Now, today's devotional returns to the historical narrative in 2 Samuel 19. As a point of reference, remember, David, his family, and his servants had fled to Gilead on the east side of the Jordan River, where he had fled during Absalom's insurrection. Now, the news of Absalom's death overwhelmed David's heart more than the heartaches and humiliation he had suffered. The news of Absalom's death moved the king, who physically trembled with grief. Absalom was dead, and David bewailed him in a bedchamber, crying, "Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." Well, that brings us to 2 Samuel 19. And Joab, one of David's generals, challenges David's perspective. Now, returning victorious from the battlefield where he had slain Absalom, Joab, one of the three captains of David's forces, received the news. 2 Samuel 19 and verse 1. "Behold, the king weepeth and mourneth for Absalom." Now those loyal to David returned from their victory only to learn the king was grieving the death of his son. Ashamed to be gloating in their victory when the king grieved the death of his son, we read in verses 2 and 3 that the victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people. For the people heard say that day how the king was grieved for his son. In verse 3 we read, "And the people gat them by stealth." They sneaked away, quietly withdrew that day into the city, as people being ashamed, still away when they flee in battle. Now, feeling David's sorrow was unacceptable, and knowing the heartache Absalom had brought upon Israel, Joab reproved the king, and his manner betrayed his contempt for David. Now remember, this Joab had been commanded by David to cover the murder of Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, in 2 Samuel chapter 11. In appearance, David cared more for his enemies, Absalom and those who followed him, than his faithful servants. And rightfully, Joab urged the king to greet the soldiers returning from the battle in verse 7. And then warned, should he fail to honor his servants, Joab threatened every man in Israel would abandon the king. And David, rising from his bed in sorrow, sat in the gate of the city and was present when the soldiers passed before him. Now, verses 9 through 12, we find what I'm topicking as David's patience. Though there might have been cause for David and his army to pursue and destroy all those who participated in Absalom's insurrection, the king chose to wait of the people to invite him to return to Jerusalem as their king. And those who had supported the rebellion now found themselves at the mercy of David. And they began to remember the good things that David had done as king. Israel, specifically the 10 northern tribes, was divided concerning how they would deal with the division between themselves and the king. And in verse 10, they questioned their elders, "Why speak ye not a word of bringing the king back to Jerusalem?" David had received word that the 10 tribes were ready to pursue peace in verse 11. And therefore he commanded the priest to go to his own tribe, Judah, and say, "Why are ye the last to bring the king back to his house?" Verse 11. The king appealed to the men of Judah, saying in verse 12, "Ye are my brethren, ye are my bones and my flesh. Wherefore then are ye the last of the tribes, to bring back the king?" And then there is a remarkable evidence of humility that we see on David's part, beginning in verse 13 and through verse 30. You see, David as king desired to heal the division of his kingdom. And so he began a series of encounters that revealed the godly character of the king. For instance, The king sent a message to Amasa. Who was that? He was the captain of Absalom's soldiers, but he was also a kinsman of David and a member of the tribe of Judah. And so David sends a message to Amasa, who was part of the insurrection, and he said in verse 13, "Art thou not of my bone and of my flesh?" And then sent him word saying, "Return thou and all thy servants." Now there was another man. His name was Shimei. You might remember Shimei was the man who was of the tribe of Benjamin, who was hurling stones and curses at David when he and his family and the men that were loyal to him were fleeing the city of Jerusalem during the insurrection. Well, this Shimei was the first one to meet the king when he returned to the east side, from the east side of the Jordan to the west side and entering into Israel proper. And no doubt fearing for his life, Shimei admitted his wrong and he confessed his sin, saying in verse 20, "I have sinned." Now, there was Abishai, who had wanted to slay Shimei back in chapter 19. And once again, he's ready to kill Shimei for his betrayal. And David, however, makes the decision to spare the life of his adversary. The scriptures, however, reveal in 1 Kings 2 and verse 8 that David never did trust Shimei, and Solomon would later, in chapter 2 of 1 Kings, would have to deal with him. Well, there's a third man, and his name is Mephibosheth. You might remember Mephibosheth is the son of Jonathan. Now, he had been privileged to eat at the table, the king's table, with David's family. And now he comes also to be restored to David. Now, evidencing the outward signs of distress and sorrow, we read in verse 24 that Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, literally the grandson of Saul, came down to meet the king and had neither dressed his feet nor trimmed his beard nor washed his clothes for the day David had departed until the day he came again in peace. David questioned Mephibosheth why he had not escaped the city with him. And then Mephibosheth revealed to the king details of how his servant Ziba had betrayed his trust to court the king's favor. Now that was back in chapter 19. Now Mephibosheth requested nothing for himself, but to be restored to the king's fellowship. Verse 29 of chapter 19, we find that David gives the order that the estate that Mephibosheth once owned in whole and had been wholly given to Ziba for his loyalty now was divided. And sadly, Mephibosheth, who appeared to be loyal, was slighted for no wrong, and Ziba's deceit was rewarded. And then there was a fourth man. David also remembered Barzillai, the Gileadite. Now, who was that man? He was the one that had met David when he crossed over into Gilead from the west side to the east side of the Jordan River. Well, this man was an 80-year-old man, and David desired to honor that man for his loyalty. However, Barzillai declined the honor, but he did request it to be given to another man named Chimham. Who was Chimham? We don't know. But there's good cause to believe that it might have been Barzillai's son. And then some closing thoughts. Notice then that there was a rift recorded in the last verses of 2 Samuel 19. It is between those identified as the men of Israel and those identified as the men of Judah. Judah is the royal tribe and the kinsman of David. And the appearance that he favored that tribe above the other tribes, it will become a cause of future conflicts. And then finally, we observe as a reminder, a lot of heartache in David's life, especially in the rebellion and death of his son Absalom. Thousands were lost in that civil war, and at the root of all the conflicts was the king's adultery with Bathsheba and his hand in having her husband killed. I end with a principle that we find in the Old Testament. Numbers 32 and verse 23 reminds us, be sure your sin will find you out. Got a sin, a skeleton in your closet? You better get it out. because invariably it will come back to haunt you. God bless you, my friend. Let's heed these biblical lessons from the life of David. Bye-bye.